All of those risks may have been prevented with proper planning as well as execution.
We have this philosophy that you need to have sufficient choice before making the selection. Even a good supplier needs to be followed. Vietnam is very much about relationships, and be careful. Well-prepared job is half done.
Have you encountered any big issue when you were dealing with your supplier? Maybe you had supplier stealing your ideas, directly working with your competition, or you had big issue when you were starting a production, or worse than that, you had defects when you received your container at home. All of those risks may have been prevented with proper planning as well as execution, and it's going to be the topic of our today's video. Pietro, I'm very happy to have you today to discuss about those important issues that many industrial players, when they are outsourcing their production, or brand owners, when they are working with a supplier in Asia, often encounter. And as I say, most of their pain points could actually have been predicted and solved before they even arise. Pietro, you bring more than 20 years of experience in Vietnam. Can you give us a quick 1-minute introduction about yourself?
Yeah, thank you, Guillaume. So yes, I have been in Vietnam since 2009, supporting foreign companies in developing their supply chains. And that has been for several industries, from steel, furniture industries, garment industries, and lately also electronics, which is a rising industry in Vietnam.
Thanks for this quick introduction. So Pietro, coming back to today's topic, the risk management and the main pain points and then difficulties that you can encounter when you are building a supply chain overseas. Let's start by I would say the first basic things. How do you effectively find the right supplier and not find a supplier that finally, after a couple of turning around, you see issues?
Yeah, this is very important. So the preliminary work is very important in this case. We see a lot of people selecting suppliers based on second-hand information, promotion, things like that, which in the end doesn't turn very well in many cases. There are all kinds of people in the markets who are trying to chase new customers for their family factories, and nothing guarantees that the factory is the most suitable for you. We have this philosophy that you need to have sufficient choice before making the selection. And this is important. So not jumping directly into one supplier, but selecting it from several good suppliers is important. So this is the only way to avoid the problems later. When you have the problems already, there is not much you can do typically on those, and it will continue also. So understanding the suppliers, their competencies, capacities, and matching them to your own needs is very important. Typical case where you might have problems, and what we recently have seen also with one customer who came to us to see new suppliers, is that the supplier is too big comparing to your own manufacturing needs, which means that you are maybe only 2% of total volume of the factory. 2% will be also the service level what you get from the factory. So it's important that you are, as a customer, important customer for the factory also, but not the only one also. So two extremities have to be avoided. It's important to understand also, whereas typically, for example, Chinese suppliers are looking for high volume, low mix type of customers. Vietnam instead is very happy with low volume, high mix type of customers. They are here and ready to build a long-term relationship. They are not so interested in one big deal and then it's gone. They want to build for the future. So these kind of parameters are important to understand, because they also are different in many cases from customers' existing supply chain. And what comes to the risk management in general, it's a totality of issues. Even a good supplier needs to be followed. So you need some support locally to guarantee that the manufacturing process stays in timeline and materials are available early enough. Products which are made are conform to your own drawings or tech packs, and also the final inspection to avoid any surprises when the container is coming. So there is different steps which are not obligatory but very good to do while manufacturing here.
So what you are saying is that preliminary, you need to get enough suppliers so you can really have a benchmark. So you don't just go with the first one that you
Yes.
find on Alibaba and it's going to be just a trial and error type of things. You're going to just waste 6 months, a year, maybe a bit of money. Rather getting enough suppliers so you start with the proper understanding about the different pros and cons of each of them, what they can offer to you. Are they also just willing to take over and then to start a collaboration? So that could be the first thing. And then, as you also emphasize, making sure that what you will gather from, for example, online informations is also true. So going on site, doing a quick due diligence, assessing the factories is also a must. And after that, when you really have an operation, that getting either your own team or hiring a third-party company that can also make sure that things are in order are a must and offer kind of a full scope of risk assurance or risk management to control the whole operation.
Yeah, this is true, and I would put very much weight on the audits also what we do. So when we are selecting suppliers from the long list to the short list, and especially the shortlisted suppliers, then we go and audit. We look really the company from A to Z, all the workshops and all how they are operating and what kind of experience and competencies they have. This is the key issue. But I would like to strengthen the point also about the relationships. Vietnam is very much about relationships, and our customers have to visit all the candidates before making any choices, because even it's technically, we do technical work and things like that, but the final decision between the supplier and the customer is done on the relational level. So customers have to visit those factories, create their own network, create their own relationship with the suppliers, and from there it will go forward.
Okay, that's great to emphasize about that audit. Just an example that come in my mind when you were sharing is that it also one supplier that was in the shortlist at one point, and when we conducted the audit, we actually realized that in terms of the waste treatment, it's not at all what they have shared. Everything is going in the river, and he was, like going around. When we conducted the audit, he was like, yeah, it's behind the black door over there. There is the waste treatment. And finally, nothing was really much following the standard that was supposed to be on the website. Is this something that is common regarding to the regulations and the requirements of the industrial zone, that those things are now more controlled by the local authorities? Or is there still difficulties that if you don't know, you may actually never realize and finally realize, okay, your supplier is not exactly.
Yeah, this has changed over the years. In 2009, when I came to Vietnam, there were plenty of factories which were outside of industrial zones, which meant that they were not controlled and they didn't have the facilities. For example, wastewater treatment, it didn't exist because they were in the middle of nowhere, which meant that they dispatched every wastewater, for example, directly to the nature, rivers, or wherever. And it was not controlled. Over the years, the government has pushed all those manufacturers to move into industrial zones, which are providing the waste management, the wastewater management, the water, the electricity, everything. So it's easier to control everything when those things are provided by the local authority, the industrial zone. But there is still a lot of things to do in Vietnam. It's not perfect at all in many cases, and things are moving slowly forward. What is interesting is that over the last years, let's say maybe 5 years, we have seen more and more of our customers interested also about the suppliers' sustainability in different things. Child labor has been always one of the no-nos We see companies really demanding proper waste treatment independently of the industry. It can be in the steel, metal type of industry, or garments or furniture industry. So the waste has to be treated correctly. And we see also that, for example, in garment industry, more and more the waste, textile waste, is used by the company itself to produce steam, which is then used for the ironing of the final products. We see also companies who are selling their waste to waste collectors, which are then handling it. So things are better, but there is still many things to do in certain industries, for example.
So it's great that you have emphasized on this audit phase. That is very important to make sure that you don't only look at company profile, but you really visit the premises of the factories.
Absolutely.
And you make sure that things are followed. Now, what about when there is a production run? I would say a first batch of orders, a production ramp up. What might be the risk that companies may encounter at this time? Like lack of understanding, not being aligned with the standards. If there's things that arise, then that may slow down the first production run.
It is like that. Surprisingly, I have to tell that several cases where our customers' own drawings or tech packs are not fully ready. So there are some points which they have to ask and to develop and things like that. But a very good way to operate in Vietnam is that when there is the production ramp up, there are the company representatives in place. So somebody from the company's customers' own manufacturing plants who knows how the product has to be done is following how the supplier is taking over. Typically, it takes a week or 2 weeks maximum to follow up, and then the supplier knows exactly how to do which things to take in consideration, which are the weak points, and so on. So that is for the production ramp up.
That's something very important that we touch right now, is that we are the Vietnamese experts. We can find you good suppliers, but the mindset of the factories in Vietnam, they are, I would say, 80 to 90% fully OEM. So they will listen to the specifications, they will listen to the requirements. They want the customer to tell them what are the tolerance, what are the standards. And from this, they will put all the SOPs, all the quality control. But if, as a customer, you expect the factory to be suggesting ideas, suggesting improvement points, you are not on the right market for that. And that's more something that is done in the West. So when you enter the Vietnamese market for purely and you should have that ownership into, you know, your product yourself, you have done maybe a couple of tests before, and then you come up with a sample, or you come up with something that is already almost defined. And then this is where you find the right sweet spot between, okay, a factory owner that can suggest you ideas, etc., but not expecting that everything should be coming from your supplier, and that they will be, you know, opening your door, spending 6 hours with you in the workshops. That's not how we should work. So that alignment to be actually a disclaimer. Now we have touched that ramp up phase. When you have ongoing orders, let's say you have done a few containers with a certain factory, you hear sometime that, oh, they want to discuss the price, or there are lack of raw materials, they may replace some of the wood species by others. Is this something that is common as well, that just a factory will try to, you know, get a little bit of more margin on certain orders, so replace existing materials by others, or use their existing stock? Is this something that can also be a risk?
Well, it is a risk, but it is an opportunity at the same time. And it depends very much of the industry. When you are in the steel components and things like that, there is no much what you can replace. Materials are specified, and there is only 1 or 2 max materials. When you go to, for example, garment industries, all the trims can be also local. So originally they have been designed by Western standards, but you might have local suppliers also for the same trims, which can reduce the overall price also. Our customers are also looking, in many cases, when they are seriously looking for outsourcing in Vietnam, they are also looking for the raw material supply chain and trying to localize as much as possible. The reason for this might be also that they want to have really a product which is made in Vietnam, which has the certificate of origins which on them size requires certain level of local materials and things like that. But that is typically, for example, in the car assembly industry, where it's very important thing. So they want to localize as much as possible all the raw material or the components, for example, windows and handles or whatsoever, and not to import them into Vietnam. So it's an opportunity, but it's a risk also in that respect if the supplier, without asking, starts to use different product what was specified. So this is something which must be controlled locally. It's more difficult to control later on, especially if the product is something where the changed component is hidden in one way, and so on. So all these kind of risks have to be assessed and controlled locally. So you need the local support also, kind of quality control team here.
As in typical case, I was yesterday in an outdoor factory. They are doing outdoor type of furnitures made in Vietnam, but for the thick sources, they can either import it from Laos, they can import it from Brazil. So, and there is a 15% gap. So it can also be quite tempting from a factory that doesn't have a lot of ethics. They want to see if they can get this 15% markup directly in the pocket to be tempted into replacing if finally the client is not here, the client is not on the ground. They've been knowing them from online discussions. So it can be something that, of course, some companies may try. Now, something that you have touched on is that certificate of origin. Vietnam relies a lot of imported materials, for example, for garments. This is a risk then that companies may encounter if all the technical fabrics, all the trims, all the accessories are imported to make backpack, that if the local manufacturing work is too low, then your product can be reclassified as CO China, even though part of the assembly is done in Vietnam, can be recategorized. You can get a higher import classification when you are exporting. That's also a risk that may be assessed early on to make sure that raw materials or work is done from the country.
That is a risk also, and this can be easily done beforehand already. Regulations are quite clear on this. All the components which are making part of the made in Vietnam are clearly specified. And we have not seen very many times this problem, in the matter of fact, because all the shipping costs of the incoming raw materials, they are Vietnam. Markup is Vietnam. All the activities which are done in Vietnam are made in Vietnam. And this, in many cases, is enough to justify the certificate of origin. I don't remember any customer who have had this kind of problem, but when you have the certificate, then it's up to customs to show that this is not valid. The workload is on the customs, not necessarily on the supplier.
Okay, so we had covered the audit phase, that is important. We have covered the quality control aspects. So from the raw materials to make sure there is no substitutions, to the inline inspection, that is also very important to make sure that you will prevent delays, you will prevent defects, and you not only rely on the final inspection just before they're going to load the container. There are things that are common and that must be taken to minimize the risks. What could be now also the risk in terms of IP? Because you rely on a supplier, they be also tempted to sell to your direct competition, to maybe brand themselves as their own designs and sell it to new markets. It's something that is also common in Asia.
It's common in Asia. It's very common in more developed countries of Asia, like China, where this is more frequent. The difference is coming from the business culture and the business or general manufacturing structure of the countries. So Vietnam is a country which is mainly and very fine-tuned for outsourced manufacturing. So Vietnamese entrepreneurs are not creating their own brands and trying to sell them to foreign markets. They are, in the matter of fact, very bad on that. They don't do it, they don't like to do it, and they are concentrating in the manufacturing. So stealing an IP of their customer, what would they do with that? They basically have only the domestic market to sell it, and it's not worth doing. So the whole mindset of the manufacturing industries, the authorities, the people working there is for outsourced manufacturing. This is the key issue.
Okay. It's great, Pietro, that you have touched that point that Vietnamese are not good sales, and it's not very often to find companies that go overseas, that go to trade show to exhibit their latest innovations. They'll be more having that mindset of contract manufacturing. That's why in terms of IP, it can be slightly more controllable, I would say, in Vietnam. Now, how could we basically build a sustainable and resilient supply chain? By basically multiplying the different suppliers, by building option B. Option B can be in different markets, but option B can be within Vietnam to have another supplier. Is it something that large SME and MNC also consider, having 80% of the production in China? Within China, they have multiple suppliers. They have 20% in Vietnam. Within Vietnam, they will also build resilient. It is something that you can somehow have more control over your supply chain, and it is something that you would recommend any companies to build early on?
This depends a little bit of the company, but what we see very much is that Vietnam is used as a secondary supply chain. So even companies, we have customers who have their own manufacturing in China, and still they want to outsource one part of the production to Vietnam, for example, and build new capacity this way. The reasons might be lack of capacity, image, tariffs, so geopolitics and everything like that. But the key issue is that if we speak about resilient supply chains, the work has to be done well, which means that you don't jump to any just one supplier accidentally because you don't know what is behind. Web pages are far away from the truth in most of the cases. They are either too good or either too bad in some cases. Also, full audits in terms of operations. I'm not speaking about financial audits, but operational audits can bring out the supplier network, which is worth using, and especially not to rely in the first or only one supplier. You might have been told, somebody told you that this is a good supplier, but that was 3 years ago, and so on. Things are moving also fast. And for example, if we think about factories which we have audited 2 years ago, we don't feel that it's any more valid to audit. We need to audit them again and see what has changed during the time. In many times, luckily, the things have moved forward. But there are cases also where things are going bad, especially after COVID. So the key issue is to have a large enough choice in the beginning, meeting all those choices, factories, and then only after that select the suppliers based on facts, not by hearsaying or anything like that.
Okay, thanks, Pietro. I think it gives a good wrap up of how companies should think, should prepare early on to also make a wise decision. We have made actually a manufacturing white paper that highlights some of the key points that we have discussed today, and I would really encourage you to download it. You can just check below in the description. You leave us your email and we will send it right away. And obviously, Pietro and I, we are very open for one-to-one conversations. It's great to also understand about the problems of our customer, how do they see Asia as a whole in terms of building up supply chains. So definitely, if you have ideas and you would like to develop your supply chain in Vietnam or elsewhere, feel free to reach out to us. Pietro, a last word for our audience?
Be careful. Well-prepared job is half done.
Okay. Thank you, Pietro, and I'll
Thank
see you
you.
in the next video.
Thank you.